Commander Zephex stood on the bridge of his warship and watched another world burn beneath him. The orange flames spread across the cities of Veltos Prime like hungry insects eating everything in their path. This was the 17th world he had conquered for the Catharian Empire, and it felt no different from all the others. The Veltos people had fought well enough in their own simple way. They had decent ships and brave soldiers, but they lacked the advanced technology that made Catharian victory certain. When their defenses crumbled and their government saw the futility of continued resistance, they had done what every intelligent species did when faced with overwhelming force. They surrendered. Zephex turned away from the burning planet and walked to his command chair. His crimson armor bore the marks of many campaigns, and his reputation among the Empire's enemies was well earned. He was known as the Silent Death because his fleets struck without warning, and his victories came swift and clean, no unnecessary destruction and no pointless cruelty. War was a tool of policy, not a playground for sadists. His aide approached with a datapad containing new orders from the High Command. Zephex read through the information with practiced efficiency. Another species had violated Imperial territory. Another conquest was required. The target this time was a young race called humans, who had been expanding into space that rightfully belonged to the Empire. The intelligence report made for boring reading. Humans were a primitive species from a backwater system called Sol. They had only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their military technology was laughably outdated. Their largest ships were barely half the size of a Catharian cruiser, and their weapons were crude kinetic projectiles and simple energy beams. The report estimated that a standard Catharian battle group could subdue the entire human fleet within days. Zephex found himself almost disappointed. After the challenging campaign against the crystal cities of Nexus Prime, he had hoped for a more interesting opponent. The humans seemed to offer nothing more than target practice for his gunners. Still, orders were orders, and the Empire demanded that human expansion be stopped before it became a genuine inconvenience. Light years away, Captain Jake Morrison sat in his ready room aboard the UES Liberty and stared at the alien message that had just arrived through subspace. The translation software had worked overtime to decode the Catharian ultimatum, but the meaning was crystal clear. Humanity had 72 hours to withdraw all ships and installations from the Kepler 442 system or face the consequences. Morrison had been fighting wars since he was old enough to hold a rifle. The Mars colony uprising had taught him everything. He needed to know about impossible odds and desperate struggles. He had seen good soldiers die for bad causes and watched cowards run when brave men needed them most. The one thing he had learned above all others was that backing down from a bully only encouraged them to hit harder next time. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Parker knocked on his door and entered without waiting for permission. She carried a datapad with long-range sensor readings that painted a grim picture. 12 Catharian heavy cruisers were approaching the system, along with support vessels and troop transports. The human force consisted of 4 ships, including Morrison's own Command Parker. Set the datapad on his desk and looked him straight in the eye. She had served with him long enough to read his moods, and she could see the determination building behind his calm exterior. The smart move would be to withdraw and hope that Earth's diplomats could find a peaceful solution. The military move would be to fall back and fight a defensive campaign closer to home where human forces could concentrate their strength. Morrison stood up and walked to the viewport that showed the blue-green world of Kepler 442b, where human colonists were building new lives under an alien sun. 3,000 families had risked everything to travel across the void and start fresh on this distant world. They had children playing in the streets of New Denver and farmers planting crops in soil that had never known human footsteps. The captain thought about his own daughter back on Earth and wondered what kind of galaxy she would inherit. Would it be one where humanity cowered before superior technology and accepted whatever scraps the older races were willing to throw them? Or would it be one where humans stood up for themselves regardless of the odds? He turned back to Parker and saw his own resolve reflected in her face. They both knew what had to be done, even if it meant flying into certain death. The Catharians had made the mistake of thinking that humans would react like every other species they had conquered. They expected surrender when resistance became costly. They anticipated negotiation when destruction seemed certain. Morrison activated the ship-wide communication system and heard his voice echo through every compartment of the Liberty. He told his crew about the alien ultimatum and the approaching enemy fleet. He explained that they were outnumbered and outgunned. He made it clear that anyone who wanted to leave could take a shuttle to the planet below, and no one would think less of them. Not a single person left their post. Morrison smiled grimly as he realized that the Catharians were about to learn something that no alien species had discovered about humanity. When humans were cornered, they did not become more reasonable. They became more dangerous. The fleet that had conquered 17 worlds was about to meet an enemy that would rather die fighting than live kneeling. Commander Zefex would soon understand that war was indeed nothing new, but human fury was something the galaxy had never seen before. The battle began exactly as Zefex had predicted it would. His fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler 442 system in perfect formation with weapons charged and shields at maximum power. The human ships were waiting for them, in a defensive line that showed more courage than sense. 4 vessels against 12 with technology that belonged in a museum. Zefex gave the order to advance and watched his tactical display light up with weapon signatures. The humans opened fire at extreme range with their primitive railguns and chemical rockets. The kinetic projectiles struck Catharian shields and disappeared in harmless flashes of energy. Their missiles exploded uselessly against deflector barriers that had been designed to stop far more sophisticated weapons. The return fire was devastating and precise. Catharian plasma cannons reached across the void with beams of superheated matter that could melt through ship hulls like fire through paper. The human vessel on the left flank took a direct hit to its engine section and began venting atmosphere in a cloud of glittering crystals. Another ship lost its main gun turrets to a perfectly placed shot that left it drifting helpless. Zefex nodded with satisfaction as he watched the engagement unfold according to standard doctrine. The enemy would realize the futility of resistance within minutes and begin transmitting surrender terms. Every intelligent species followed the same pattern when faced with overwhelming technological superiority. Pride gave way to pragmatism, and pragmatism led to capitulation. But the humans did not surrender. Instead of broadcasting terms of defeat, they did something that froze Zefex in his command chair with shock and disbelief. The 2 damaged ships changed course and accelerated directly toward his formation at maximum thrust. Their captains were attempting ramming attacks against vessels that outmassed them 5-1. The first ship struck the Catharian cruiser Vengeance amidships, with an impact that sent shockwaves through both hulls. The human vessel crumpled like paper, but its momentum carried burning wreckage through the enemy's reactor section. The explosion that followed lit up the darkness with the brief fury of a newborn star. Vengeance died with all hands in a fireball that could be seen from the planet below. The second ramming ship aimed for the fleet flagship where Zefex himself stood frozen in horror. Point defense systems filled space with interceptor fire, but the human captain had plotted his course with suicidal precision. The UES Defiance struck the flagship's port side and tore a gash through 3 decks before its reactor went critical. Emergency bulkheads sealed the breach, but not before atmosphere and crew were sucked into the vacuum commander. Zefex found himself thrown across his bridge by the impact, while damage reports flooded in from every section. His flagship was wounded, but still functional. The same could not be said for the heavy cruiser Justice, which had taken secondary damage from flying debris and was listing badly to starboard with power failures throughout its superstructure Lisa. Parker watched the ramming attacks from the bridge of the Liberty and felt a savage satisfaction burn in her chest. 2 human ships had died, but they had taken a Catharian cruiser with them and damaged 2 others. The odds were still impossible, but at least the aliens were bleeding now. At least they knew they were in a fight Captain Morrison stood at his command station and studied the tactical display with the cold calculation of a man who had already accepted death. The Liberty and one other human vessel remained operational against 10 enemy ships. Basic mathematics said they could not win, but mathematics had never accounted for the depth of human stubborn pride. He opened a channel to the surviving human ship and spoke to Captain Ryan Webb, who commanded the destroyer Phoenix. Both men knew what had to be done, and neither bothered with lengthy speeches or emotional farewells. They were professionals who understood their duty and the price it demanded. The two remaining human ships split apart and attacked the Catharian formation from different angles. The Phoenix went high while the Liberty dove low in a maneuver that forced the enemy to divide their fire. Plasma beams lashed out in all directions as Catharian gunners struggled to track two fast-moving targets that refused to fight by conventional rules. Morrison ordered all power diverted to engines and weapons. Life support could wait, and artificial. Gravity was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Liberty shuddered as its overloaded reactors pushed it to speeds that made the hull groan with stress. Emergency lights bathed the bridge in hellish red illumination, while sparks flew from overloaded control panels. The human ships dove into the heart of the enemy formation like wolves attacking a flock of sheep. They fired at point-blank range, where Catharian shields were weakest, and their own superior maneuverability gave them brief windows of opportunity. The Phoenix managed to gut a destroyer with a lucky shot before return fire turned it into expanding plasma. Morrison felt his ship shudder as plasma beams found their mark and began eating through the hull. Bulkheads failed and compartments decompressed, but still the Liberty fought on with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Human engineering crews worked miracles to keep weapons online, while Marines prepared for boarding action that might never come. Zephex watched the impossible battle unfold on his screens and tried to understand what he was seeing. These humans fought like no enemy he had ever encountered. They became more dangerous as they took damage and more aggressive as their situation became hopeless. Death seemed to inspire them rather than frighten them into surrender. The Liberty finally succumbed to overwhelming firepower, but not before inflicting damage on 3 more Catharian vessels. Its reactor containment failed in a controlled overload that Captain Morrison triggered manually from his burning bridge. The explosion was smaller than the earlier ramming attacks, but still powerful enough to cripple a nearby enemy cruiser. When the shooting finally stopped, Zephex found himself staring at a battlefield littered with wreckage from both sides. His fleet had won, but at a cost that made victory taste like ashes in his mouth. 3 cruisers destroyed and 5 more damaged against an enemy force that should have been swatted aside like insects. The silence on the Catharian bridge was broken, only by the soft beeping of emergency systems and the distant sound of repair crews working to patch hull breaches. Zephex looked around at his surviving officers and saw his own confusion reflected in their faces. They had just witnessed something that military doctrine said was impossible. An enemy that fought harder when losing and became more dangerous when wounded. Warriors who viewed death in battle not as defeat, but as an acceptable price for inflicting damage on their enemies. Zephex realized with growing dread that he had just encountered something far more dangerous than superior technology or overwhelming numbers. He had met an enemy that simply would not quit. The victory celebration on the Catharian homeworld was the quietest in living memory. Fleet Admiral Koreth stood before the High Council and delivered his report on the Kepler 442 campaign with none of the usual pride that accompanied successful conquests. 3 heavy cruisers destroyed and 5 more requiring months of repair work, all to defeat 4 primitive human vessels that should have been swept aside in minutes. The casualty reports made even worse reading. Over 2,000 Catharian warriors, dead including some of the Empire's most experienced ship commanders. The humans had lost perhaps 300 crew members total, but they had made every death count in ways that defied conventional military thinking. No species in galactic history had inflicted such disproportionate losses. While facing impossible odds, Dr. Alex Grant arrived at the battlefield 3 days after the shooting stopped. His research vessel had been following the human expansion into disputed space, and he wanted to study the wreckage before salvage teams cleared it away. What he found among the drifting debris changed his understanding of human nature forever. The hulks of human ships showed evidence of modifications that should have been impossible to implement during combat. Cargo compartments had been converted into improvised weapons bays. Life support systems had been rerouted to provide extra power to gun batteries. The humans had literally rebuilt their vessels while fighting for their lives. Grant examined the remains of the UES Defiance and found that its crew had welded additional armor plating to critical systems using materials stripped from their own quarters. They had sacrificed comfort and safety for a few extra minutes of combat effectiveness. The bridge showed blast damage from a plasma hit that should have killed everyone instantly, but the command crew had somehow continued fighting for another 20 minutes. The most disturbing discovery came when Grant accessed the ship's final data logs. Captain Webb had recorded a message for his family just before ordering the ramming attack that destroyed his ship and a Catharian cruiser. His voice was calm and steady as he explained that dying for Earth was better than living under alien rule. The recording ended with him singing an old human song about freedom that Grant found hauntingly beautiful. Commander Zephex spent 2 weeks in a medical bay having his injuries treated and his mind examined by Catharian psychiatrists. The doctors assured him that his reaction to the battle was normal given the unprecedented nature of human tactics. No Catharian officer had ever faced an enemy that fought with such reckless disregard for their own survival. The official reports described human behavior as tactically unsound and strategically counterproductive. Military analysts noted that the heavy casualties made human victory impossible, regardless of their temporary success at inflicting damage. But Zephex knew something that the analysts missed. The humans had not been trying to win in any conventional sense. They had been sending a message to the entire galaxy. A declaration that attacking humanity would cost more than any rational species was willing to pay. The 4 ships at Kepler 442 had died to ensure that future battles would be fought on human terms rather than alien ones. Colonel Sarah Davis had been the senior officer aboard the destroyer Phoenix when plasma fire finally overwhelmed her ship's defenses. She survived the destruction of her vessel only because she had been sealed in an armored compartment when the hull split open. Catharian rescue teams found her floating in an escape pod 18 hours after the battle ended. The interrogation sessions that followed gave Catharian intelligence their first real insight into human psychology. Davis answered their questions with a directness that left her captors deeply uncomfortable. She explained that humans had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill them. Predators and diseases and natural disasters had forged a species that thrived on adversity. When asked why humans fought so desperately against hopeless odds, Davis smiled for the first time since her capture. She told them about the children playing in the streets of New Denver and the farmers planting crops in alien soil. She described the hope in their eyes when they looked up at the stars and dreamed of the future their species might build among them. The Catharian interrogators pressed her for technical information about human military capabilities. But Davis kept bringing the conversation back to family and home and the dreams that made life worth living. She spoke of her own daughter back on Earth and the world she wanted to leave for the next generation. A world where humans could walk tall among the stars instead of crawling in the shadows. Her final statement to the Intelligence Committee became legendary among both species. When asked what would happen if the Catharian Empire decided to invade human space directly, Davis looked each alien official in the eye and delivered her answer with quiet conviction. She told them that every human world would fight like Kepler 442. Every ship would ram rather than surrender. Every soldier would choose death before dishonor. The implications of her words sent shockwaves through the highest levels of Catharian government. Military planners began calculating the cost of conquering human space, and the numbers were sobering. If every human system fought like Kepler 442, the Empire would lose its entire fleet before reaching Earth. The financial cost alone would bankrupt the Imperial Treasury intelligence reports from human space, painted an even more disturbing picture. News of the battle had spread through their colonies like wildfire, and the reaction was not despair, but rage. Human military recruitment had increased by 300%. Civilian shipyards were converting cargo vessels into warships using technology that prioritized firepower over crew survival. Admiral Korath found himself in the unprecedented position of recommending caution to the High Council. The humans were clearly inferior in terms of technology and numbers, but they possessed something far more dangerous. They had the will to pay any price for freedom and the courage to make their enemies pay an even higher price for conquest. Debate that followed split the Catharian leadership between hawks who demanded immediate invasion and doves who urged diplomatic solutions. The hawks argued that human resistance would only grow stronger with time and that swift action could prevent a larger conflict. The doves pointed to the casualty reports from Kepler 442 and asked if any victory was worth such losses. Zefex received new orders a month after the battle. He was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of the largest invasion force in Catharian history. His mission was to break human resistance once and for all by striking directly at their core systems. The High Council wanted humanity crushed before their example could inspire other subject races to rebellion. As his new flagship left the shipyards, Zefex studied intelligence reports about human military preparations and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. The humans were not preparing to defend their worlds in any conventional sense. They were preparing to make conquest so costly that the Empire would never attempt it again. He thought about Colonel Davis and her quiet certainty that humans would never surrender. He remembered the ramming attacks that had turned certain victory into Pyrrhic success. Most of all, he wondered what other surprises humanity might have waiting for him in the darkness between the stars. The Empire had awakened something that it did not understand and could not control. War was indeed nothing new, but human fury was about to teach the galaxy lessons that no species would ever forget. Admiral Nathan Cross stood in the war room beneath New Geneva and watched as tactical displays showed the approaching Catharian invasion fleet. 60 ships, including some of the largest vessels ever built by the alien empire. Against this armada, Earth could field perhaps 20 warships and twice as many converted civilian craft. The numbers were even worse than Kepler 442, but Cross was smiling. The recordings from the first battle had changed everything humanity thought it knew about galactic warfare. The aliens had superior technology, but they fought like civilized beings, who valued their own lives. They retreated when losses became unacceptable and surrendered when victory seemed impossible. Humans had no such limitations. Cross turned to address the assembled officers who represented every branch of human military service. Marines and Navy personnel stood beside pilots and engineers, while behind them sat the civilian leaders who had voted for total war rather than negotiated surrender. The decision had been unanimous despite the cost everyone knew it would demand. The Admiral began his briefing with a simple statement that would define human strategy for the coming campaign. If they could not match alien technology, they would compensate with tactics no sane species would attempt. Every ship would carry boarding parties trained for suicide missions. Every weapon would be designed to inflict maximum damage regardless of crew survival. Every battle would be fought as if the fate of humanity depended on its outcome. Lieutenant Ben Taylor listened to the briefing from his position near the back of the room. He commanded a squadron of converted cargo haulers that had been fitted with ramming spikes and overloaded reactors. His crews were all volunteers who understood that their mission had no provision for retreat or rescue. They would ram enemy vessels and die in the explosions that followed. The transformation of human military doctrine horrified outside observers, but it reflected a fundamental truth about the species. Humans had evolved from persistence hunters, who chased prey across vast distances until exhaustion made the kill inevitable. They applied the same relentless pressure to warfare and would rather die fighting than accept defeat. Captain Laura West commanded one of the few purpose-built warships in the human fleet. The UES Vengeance had been constructed using lessons learned from Kepler 442 and incorporated design features that prioritized firepower over crew protection. Her mission was to lead the first wave of human raiders against Catharian supply lines. The raids began 3 months before the main invasion fleet reached human space. West and her volunteers struck at isolated outposts and convoy routes with a precision that suggested months of careful planning. The attacks were brutal and effective, but what disturbed Catharian commanders most was the complete absence of any escape plan. Human raiders fought until their ships were destroyed or their objectives were achieved. Prisoners were rare because human crews preferred death to captivity. The few survivors who were captured spoke of duty and honor and sacrifice with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. West's final mission took her squadron deep into Catharian territory, where they targeted a major supply depot that fed 3 different invasion fleets. The base was heavily defended, and the human ships were detected long before they could achieve surprise. The rational response would have been to withdraw and try again later with better intelligence. Instead, West ordered her ships to accelerate toward the target at maximum thrust, while broadcasting a message that became legendary in human space. She told Earth that her crews had held the line and made their deaths count. She promised that every Catharian who died that day would serve as a warning to others who threatened human worlds. The attack succeeded beyond all expectations. The supply depot was completely destroyed, along with 15 Catharian vessels that had been refueling there. The explosion could be seen from orbit, and the shock wave damaged installations throughout the system. The cost was the complete destruction of West's squadron, but no one in human space considered the exchange unfavorable. Zephex received reports of the raids with growing unease. His invasion fleet was still weeks away from human space, but already the humans were striking at targets hundreds of light years behind the front lines. Their intelligence network was better than anyone had suspected, and their willingness to sacrifice entire crews for single missions was proving devastatingly effective. The Catharian supply situation became critical as human raids targeted every vulnerable installation within reach. Convoys required massive escorts that reduced the forces available for the main invasion. Repair facilities were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Most disturbing of all, the humans seemed to have an unlimited supply of volunteers willing to die for their cause. Intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture of human preparations for the coming invasion. Every colony world had been turned into a fortress with civilian populations trained for guerrilla warfare. Ships that could not fight had been converted into mobile bombs designed to ram enemy vessels. Even medical facilities had been militarized to serve as command centers if the main bases were destroyed. Dr. Helen Ross had been studying Catharian psychology for years before the war began. Her research into alien behavior patterns had made her one of Earth's leading experts on enemy capabilities and weaknesses. When she was captured during a failed intelligence mission, the Catharians thought they had gained valuable insight into human planning. The interrogation sessions revealed more about Catharian nature than human secrets. Ross explained to her captors that they fundamentally misunderstood what they were fighting. The humans were not a military force in any conventional sense. They were an entire species that had decided to treat the conflict as a struggle for survival when pressed about human tactics. Ross smiled and began describing the evolutionary history that had shaped her species. She told them about ice ages and predators and plagues that had killed millions while making the survivors stronger. She explained that humans had spent their entire history fighting against impossible odds and learning to thrive in conditions that would break other species. Her captors became increasingly uncomfortable as Ross described human persistence hunting and the psychological traits that made such tactics possible. The ability to endure pain and fatigue beyond normal limits. The willingness to sacrifice individual lives for group survival. Most importantly, the refusal to quit even when victory seemed impossible. The Catharian officers who questioned her began to understand that they were not facing a conventional military opponent. They were fighting an entire species that had weaponized its own survival instincts. Every human was a potential soldier, and every battle was a test of species fitness that demanded absolute commitment. Major Rick Stone led a commando unit that specialized in infiltrating Catharian facilities and turning their own technology against them. His teams had perfected techniques for sabotaging alien equipment in ways that would cause maximum psychological damage. Enemy crews began to distrust their own ships, and Weapon Stone's greatest success came when his unit infiltrated the main Catharian fleet base and convinced the aliens that their central computer had been infected with a virus that could spread to every ship in the Empire. The panic that followed disrupted invasion preparations for months, while technicians searched for malware that existed only in their imagination. The psychological warfare campaign proved almost as effective as direct military action. Catharian. Morale began to crack as reports filtered back from the front lines. Their enemies were not rational beings who could be negotiated with or intimidated into surrender. They were something far more dangerous. Humans were a species that had decided that freedom was worth any price, and that their enemies would pay an even higher cost for attempting conquest. The invasion fleet that approached human space carried overwhelming firepower, but its crews were beginning to wonder if victory was possible against an enemy that simply refused to lose. Fleet Admiral Zephex stood on his flagship bridge and studied the latest intelligence reports while his armada prepared for the final assault on human space. The numbers still favored his forces, but the cost projections made him sick to his stomach. Military analysts estimated that conquering humanity would require the destruction of the entire Catharian fleet. For the first time in his long career, Zephex found himself hoping that the enemy would see reason and surrender before the shooting started. But he knew with growing certainty that humans would rather die as a free species than live as conquered slaves. The galaxy was about to witness something unprecedented in its long history. A war where one side cared more about winning than surviving. The war that was supposed to last weeks had now consumed 8 months, and the Catharian Empire was beginning to crack under the strain. Fleet Admiral Zephex stood in his private quarters aboard the flagship Dominance and read casualty reports that made his blood run cold. 37 ships destroyed, and twice that number requiring major repairs. All to conquer 3 human star systems that were still fighting despite being completely surrounded. The humans had turned every moon and asteroid into a fortress. They had mined the space lanes with nuclear devices scavenged from their own power plants. Most disturbing of all, they had convinced their civilian populations to fight with the same suicidal determination as their military forces. Children threw improvised grenades at Catharian patrols, while elderly humans rigged their own homes to explode when alien troops entered. Intelligence reports from across the Empire painted an even grimmer picture. Other subject races were beginning to ask dangerous questions about Catharian invincibility. The proud Nexari had sent diplomatic inquiries about human military techniques. Even the peaceful Veltans were requesting detailed battle reports from the human front. The Empire's carefully maintained image of unstoppable force was crumbling with each costly victory. Zephex activated his personal communication system and established a secure link with Admiral Koreth back on the homeworld. The conversation that followed would have been unthinkable before the human war began. For the first time in Imperial history, a field commander was requesting permission to negotiate with an inferior species. Koreth listened to Zephex's report with growing alarm. The invasion fleet had captured its objectives, but at costs that threatened the stability of the entire empire. The Treasury was nearly bankrupt from replacing destroyed vessels. Recruitment centers were empty because no one wanted to fight humans. Most dangerous of all the other galactic powers were watching with keen interest as the mighty Catharian war machine ground itself to pieces against human resistance. Dr. Helen Ross sat in her prison cell and smiled as she listened to the sounds of battle echoing through the detention facility. The humans had somehow managed to infiltrate a supposedly impregnable Catharian fortress and were now fighting there, way toward the command center. Her guards looked nervous as explosions shook the walls and emergency lights bathed everything in hellish red illumination. The rescue mission had no strategic value, and everyone involved knew it. Ross was just one captured scientist among thousands of human prisoners scattered across the Empire. But the mission served a different purpose entirely. It demonstrated to every species in the galaxy that humans would go anywhere and fight anyone. To bring their people home, Commander Jake Phillips led the rescue team through corridors filled with smoke and alien corpses. His men were outnumbered 50-1, but they had advantages that no military academy taught. They were fighting for something more important than territory or resources. They were fighting for the idea that humans never abandoned their own. The battle raged for 6 hours before Catharian reinforcements finally overwhelmed the human commandos. Phillips died with a plasma rifle in his hands and Ross's cell key in his pocket. The rescue had failed, but its impact rippled across the galaxy, like seismic shockwaves. No other species had ever attempted such a mission, and none would have succeeded as completely as the humans had. Ross found herself summoned before the Catharian High Council to explain human behavior to leaders who were beginning to question everything they thought they knew about warfare. She looked around the magnificent chamber with its soaring architecture and priceless artwork and felt only pity for the beings who had built it. The questions came in a steady stream as alien officials tried to understand what made humans different from every other species they had conquered. Ross answered each inquiry with patient honesty that left her audience increasingly uncomfortable. She explained that humans did not fight to preserve what they had, but to secure what they might become. When asked about human casualty rates and their apparent disregard for military losses, Ross laughed softly and began describing the mathematics of survival that had shaped her species. She told them about wars where entire generations had died to secure freedom for their children. She spoke of sacrifices made not for immediate gain, but for distant possibilities that might never be realized. The alien officials pressed her for details about human military doctrine and strategic planning, but Ross kept returning to the fundamental truth that they refused to accept. Humans were not fighting a war in any conventional sense. They were defending their right to exist as a free species and would pay any price to secure that freedom. The session ended when Ross delivered a statement that would haunt the Catharian leadership for generations to come. She told them that every species in the galaxy would eventually face the same choice that humanity faced now. They could live as subjects of a greater power, or they could fight for the right to determine their own destiny. Major Rick Stone stood in the ruins of what had once been a Catharian command post and surveyed the aftermath of his latest operation. His commando teams had perfected the art of psychological warfare to a degree that would have impressed ancient human generals. They no longer just destroyed enemy installations. They made the destruction so horrific that other Catharian units would refuse to occupy similar positions. The latest attack had involved convincing a garrison that their own computer systems were plotting against them. Stone's hackers had programmed the base's environmental controls to create subtle but persistent malfunctions that drove the alien crew to the edge of paranoia. When the actual assault began, the defenders were so rattled that they fired on their own support troops. Stone's methods were spreading throughout the human resistance as word spread about their effectiveness. Catharian forces were beginning to distrust their own equipment and question orders from their own commanders. The psychological damage was proving more devastating than physical destruction because it could not be repaired with spare parts and technical manuals. General Matt Harrison commanded the human forces, preparing for what intelligence suggested would be the final Catharian assault on Earth itself. His troops were outnumbered and outgunned, but they possessed something that money could not buy and technology could not replicate. They had the absolute certainty that they were fighting for everything that made life worth living. Harrison's plan was simple and terrifying in its implications. If the Catharians wanted Earth, they would have to fight for every meter of space. From the outer planets to the homeworld itself, every asteroid belt would be mined. Every moon would be fortified. The enemy would pay such a price for victory that the entire galaxy would learn to leave humanity alone. The preparations were unlike anything seen in galactic history. Civilian volunteers worked alongside military engineers to turn the solar system into the deadliest trap ever constructed. Nuclear warheads were hidden in seemingly harmless cargo containers. Hospital ships were converted into missile platforms. Even the orbital habitats around Mars were rigged to ram incoming vessels. News of Earth's preparations spread throughout human space and beyond. Other species watched with a mixture of awe and horror as an entire star system prepared to commit suicide rather than accept conquest. The Catharian Empire had awakened something that it could not control and did not understand. Admiral Nathan Cross received the final intelligence reports about Catharian fleet movements and felt a grim satisfaction settle in his chest. The enemy was coming in overwhelming force, but they were no longer the confident conquerors who had first threatened human space. They were a battered and demoralized force that had learned to fear the species they had once dismissed as primitive. The battle for Earth would decide more than the fate of humanity. It would determine whether the galaxy remained under the control of established powers or whether new voices would be heard among the stars. Cross looked out at the blue world below and made a silent promise to every human who had ever lived. The final lesson in human fury was about to begin. The assault on Earth never came. Fleet Admiral Zephex received the recall order as his armada gathered in the outer solar system and felt a mixture of relief and shame that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Catharian High Council had made the unprecedented decision to negotiate with a species they had been unable to conquer through force of arms. The diplomatic summit took place on a neutral space station orbiting between human and Catharian territory. Zephex found himself sitting across from Admiral Nathan Cross and trying to understand how his mighty empire had been forced to treat these primitive beings as equals. The human commander looked tired but unbroken, and his eyes held a fire that spoke of unfinished business. Dr. Amanda Clark served as the chief human negotiator, despite being the sole survivor of what intelligence analysts called the most audacious military operation in galactic history. Her commando team had attempted to strike directly at the Catharian homeworld in a mission that everyone knew was suicide. The attack had failed, but its psychological impact had shattered alien confidence beyond repair. Clark sat at the negotiating table and studied the faces of the alien officials who had ordered the deaths of so many human soldiers. She felt no hatred toward them because hatred required emotional investment in beings who mattered. These creatures were simply obstacles that had finally learned to recognize human determination and step aside. The Catharian delegation was led by Admiral Korith, who had spent months studying human military doctrine and reached conclusions that terrified his own government. The humans were not fighting a conventional war that could be won through superior tactics or overwhelming force. They were engaged in a species-wide struggle for survival that would continue until either humanity was extinct or their enemies gave up. Korith opened the negotiations with an admission that no Catharian leader had ever made before. The Empire acknowledged that it had underestimated human capabilities and was prepared to discuss terms that recognized their right to exist as an independent species. The words came hard because they represented the first crack in imperial doctrine that had governed galactic politics for centuries. Clark listened to the alien proposals with the patience of someone who had already won everything that mattered. The Catharians offered territorial concessions and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that would have satisfied any rational species. But rationality had never been humanity's greatest strength, and Clark knew that her people wanted something far more valuable than mere survival. She responded to the Catharian offers with a counter-proposal that left the alien delegation speechless. Humanity would accept peace, but only on terms that guaranteed their right to expand freely among the stars. Any attempt to limit human growth or dictate human behavior would be considered an act of war that would provoke the same response they had already witnessed. The negotiations continued for weeks as both sides struggled to find common ground between species that viewed existence itself in fundamentally different ways. The Catharians wanted stability and order and predictable boundaries that could be marked on galactic maps. Humans wanted freedom to grow and explore and become whatever their potential allowed. Zephex found himself serving as a military advisor to the diplomatic team and discovered that his experiences fighting humans had given him insights that proved invaluable to the peace process. He explained to the Catharian leadership that trying to contain humanity was like trying to hold water in their bare hands. The harder they squeezed, the faster it would slip through their fingers. The breakthrough came when Clark made a statement that reframed the entire conflict in terms that both species could understand. She told the assembled delegates that humans were not seeking to conquer anyone or build an empire that would threaten galactic stability. They simply wanted the right to exist without asking permission from species that claimed authority over the stars themselves. The final treaty established principles that would govern human expansion for generations to come. Humanity received recognition as a sovereign species with the right to colonize any unoccupied system within reasonable distance of their existing territory. In exchange, they agreed to respect the territorial claims of other species and submit disputes to arbitration rather than military action. But the most important clause of the treaty was one that both sides understood without needing to write it down. The Catharian Empire agreed never again to threaten human existence because they had learned the price of awakening a species that would rather die fighting than live in chains. Dr. Helen Ross was released as part of the prisoner exchange that accompanied the peace negotiations. She returned to human space with stories that became legend among her own people and cautionary tales among former enemies. The aliens had tried to understand human nature through interrogation and analysis, but they had only discovered how little they knew about the forces that drove their new neighbors. Ross spoke at universities and military academies about the psychological differences that had shaped the conflict. She explained that humans had evolved as persistence hunters who succeeded through endurance rather than raw power. They applied the same relentless pressure to warfare and would chase their enemies across the galaxy if necessary to secure victory. Peace that followed was unlike any in galactic history because it was based on mutual respect rather than submission by the weaker party. The Catharians had learned that some species were too dangerous to conquer and too valuable to destroy. Humans had proven that technology and numbers meant nothing against absolute determination. Captain Ryan Webb commanded the first joint human Catharian patrol vessel to monitor the new border between their territories. His ship carried crews from both species who worked together with the awkward cooperation of former enemies who had learned to respect each other's capabilities. The aliens admired human courage while humans appreciated Catharian technical expertise. Webb often stood on his bridge and reflected on the war that had changed everything both species thought they knew about themselves and each other. The Catharians had discovered that their empire was not invincible and that some victories cost more than defeat. Humans had learned that they could stand as equals among the ancient races that ruled the galaxy. The joint space station that orbited the boundary between human and Catharian space became a symbol of the new relationship between species that had nearly destroyed each other. Scientists and soldiers from both civilizations worked side by side on projects that benefited everyone while maintaining the mutual vigilance that prevented future conflicts. ZFX served as the Catharian liaison officer aboard the station and found himself genuinely respected by human personnel who had studied his tactical innovations during the war. They understood that he had been a professional doing his duty, just as they had been professionals doing theirs. The difference was that humans had been willing to die for their duty, while Catharians had expected to live through theirs. The final entry in ZFX's personal log reflected on everything he had learned about warfare and courage and the price of freedom during his encounters with humanity. He wrote that war was indeed nothing new among the species of the galaxy, but human fury was something unprecedented that had taught everyone involved new definitions of what it meant to be unbreakable. Years later, when other species asked Catharian military advisors about the secret of human success, the answer was always the same. Humans had won not because they were stronger or smarter or better equipped than their enemies. They had won because they cared more about winning than they cared about surviving, and that made them the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever produced. The peace between humans and Catharians endured because both sides understood exactly what it had cost to achieve and what it would cost to break. Freedom was indeed worth any price, but the price of threatening human freedom was something that no rational species would ever choose to pay again.